The Astronomicon flickers. Across the void, its once constant radiance shivers like a dying candle behind a cracked glass. On the bridge of a battered cruiser adrift beyond the segmentum solar, 1,000 souls hold their breath as the light that has guided humanity for 10 millennia stutters, once, twice, and then goes dark. In that silence, the void becomes a tomb, and even the machine spirits whisper prayers they do not understand. Somewhere, deep beneath the ash-choked skies of Terra, a heartbeat slows upon the golden throne. The Adeptus Custodes kneel without command. Servitors pause mid-ritual, their data slates blinking with errors no tech priest can name. And throughout the Imperium of man, a single question spreads faster than any Vox signal could carry. What happens when the Emperor's light truly dies? This is not prophecy, nor heresy. It is memory, written from the shadow of a moment that should never have been possible. For when the light fades, so too does the illusion of certainty. What remains is faith, stripped bare of glory, tested against the silence between stars. If you still believe the Imperium endures because of faith, memory, or sheer defiance, stay with us. Like this transmission so the signal endures, share it so others may find their way through the void, and subscribe to keep the light alive. For what follows is not a sermon, but a record, a remembrance whispered before extinction. It began with a sound that should not have existed, a low, trembling hum that reverberated through the bones of Terra itself. Not the steady pulse of machinery, nor the sacred drone of the golden throne, but something older, a dying note in a hymn that had no composer. The adepts who tended the mechanisms of the throne heard it first, though few dared to name what it was. Their augurs flickered, their auspexes bled static, and data slates began to record prayers as corrupted code. Some swore they could hear a heartbeat behind the distortion, uneven and distant, like the Emperor himself drawing breath through a broken world. Above the sanctum, the palace trembled. Thousands of meters of adamantium and marble groaned as if Terra were exhaling after 10,000 years of forced stillness. Custodians moved silently through the corridors, their golden armor reflecting the flicker of failing lumen strips, each movement ritualized, deliberate, as though by discipline alone they could hold back the truth. They said nothing. They did not need to. Every servant, every priest, every cogitator spirit could feel the change. The Astronomicon, humanity's beacon through the warp, the light that had never faltered, was dimming. In the navigator's spire, those born with the warp gift screamed into the darkness behind their sealed helms. Their third eyes bled and burned as the Emperor's radiance faltered, the familiar line of light that guided them across the galaxy snapping like a frayed nerve. One by one, they fell silent, some whispering fragments of hymns as their minds dissolved into the immaterium. Ships beyond the Sol system, reliant on that divine signal, suddenly found themselves adrift in a void that no longer answered their calls. Entire fleets hung in uncertainty, their forgotten how to speak. On the surface, the ecclesiarchy gathered in the Hall of the 1,000 Altars. The air was heavy with incense and desperation. Choirs of robed priests sang the litanies of continuance until their throats bled, trying to summon sound to fill the silence that the Astronomicon had left behind. The Archdeacon of Terra himself, a man whose voice could once silence storms, now trembled before the unthinkable. The light is the Emperor, and the Emperor does not fade. Yet even as he spoke, the stained glass dome above him dimmed. The sacred light refracted through it, growing colder, thinner, until the saints depicted there seemed less divine and more human, fragile, afraid, and silent. In the catacombs below the throne, tech priests of the Adeptus Mechanicus toiled in red silence. Servo arms sparked, and cogitators emitted strings of incomprehensible binary laments. Their faces were unreadable beneath steel and wire, but even they, creatures of logic and ritual, hesitated before the data streams cascading before them. The readings could not be correct. Energy output declining, astral emission density collapsing by a measurable fraction every minute. One of them, a Magos Dominus named Arethos, recorded his final entry before sealing his vox log forever. The pulse of the throne fluctuates. The machine god weeps through the flesh of his emperor. If this continues, the soul of mankind will have no anchor. I fear this is not decay. It is withdrawal. Outside, beyond the palace walls, the people of Terra did not yet know, but they felt it. Pilgrims kneeling in the dust found their prayers echoing strangely, unanswered. Voxcasters whispered static even when unpowered. Even the air seemed heavier, as if gravity itself mourned. The common citizens, those who had lived entire lives beneath the shadow of the throne, began to look upward less often. Some wept, some sang louder, desperate to fill the silence. A few simply stopped speaking at all. And amid that gathering stillness, in a small observatory overlooking the ruins of the Himalayan ridges, an old man knelt before a cracked lens. He was no priest, no soldier, just a forgotten scribe who had once catalogued the stars for the imperial astronomers. His hair was thin and white, his robes faded with age. Through the failing optics, he saw the faint shimmer that had once been the Astronomicon, a thread of light woven through eternity. Now it pulsed once, then twice, then vanished into blackness. He did not speak. He only bowed his head, ink-stained hands trembling over a blank page. When he finally wrote, the words were small and shaking, but they carried the weight of a dying age. The throne breathes, but the galaxy no longer hears. Perhaps this is not the end, but the pause before judgment. The Vox towers above the palace flickered to life briefly, carrying one final pulse of the Astronomicon before plunging into silence. Across the void, the final message reached those still listening, a sound not of words, but of light fading through the fabric of the warp. For an instant, the galaxy held its breath, and then, nothing. In the first hours after the silence, denial reigned. On Terra, denial is not weakness, it is tradition. The administratum declared it a mere fluctuation, a transient flux in the warp. The Mechanicus filed the anomaly as a temporary resonance decay. The ecclesiarchy called it a divine test. Only the custodians said nothing, and in their silence the truth grew heavy. The light was gone. Days passed in half-darkness. The sun still burned above the world, but it seemed colder somehow, less forgiving. The orbital stations that watched the Astronomicon reported nothing but static. Every transmission, every data stream, every encrypted prayer came back hollow. Pilgrims still gathered at the gates of the palace, their voices rising like a sea of desperate devotion, but now even their chants faltered. For the first time in living memory, no one could feel the emperor's gaze. In the Sanctum Imperialis, Custodian Alilius stood before the golden doors of the throne room. His armor bore the marks of centuries, scars polished but never erased. Behind those doors lay the body that was no longer a body, the being that had been both god and corpse for 10,000 years. He could feel it, something inside the chamber shifting, a rhythm once eternal now broken. The tech priests moved like ghosts around the throne, whispering their litanies, adjusting sacred mechanisms, injecting new streams of biofluid and voltage into systems that had long forgotten how to die.
Alias did not move. He was a custodian, forged to serve, to protect, to never doubt. Yet he could not ignore the truth he felt in the marrow of his ancient bones. The pulse of the throne was slowing. It was not rumor. It was not heresy. It was the sound of the impossible becoming real. He remembered the moment the light had first dimmed, a tremor in the palace, a flicker in the sacred lumen panels that never failed. For a heartbeat, every soul in the chamber had felt weightless, as though gravity itself had ceased to believe in them. Then came the quiet. Not the peace of silence, but the void of it, the absence of purpose, of meaning. Even the servo skulls hovering in the air had stuttered, their voximeters clicking like teeth in fear. Across the Imperium, reactions varied. On Mars, the Fabricator General ordered the Nospheric prayers intensified threefold. The Red Planet's forges sang louder, their hymns deafening, as though volume alone could drown out despair. In the Scala Progenium academies, drill abbots forced children to recite the creed of the Emperor Unyielding until they fainted from exhaustion. And on the shrine worlds, flames were lit that burned entire continents in tribute to a god who might never hear them again. Yet the truth could not be drowned by ritual. The Astronomicon did not return. Navigators everywhere reported only chaos in the warp, currents twisting without direction, storms that screamed with voices that were not demons and not men. Fleets lost contact with each other within hours. The Imperium had gone blind, and in its blindness, madness began to bloom. Alias descended the winding stairs beneath the palace, where the air smelled of oil and prayer. The corridor opened into a crypt where the names of long-dead custodians were etched in gold upon the walls. Here, the silence was not oppressive, it was sacred. He knelt among the tombs of his brothers and bowed his head. For a moment, he imagined he could still feel it, that faint warmth behind his mind, that presence which had always been there, vast and quiet as a star. The Emperor's will. It was like hearing the echo of a memory, fading further each time he reached for it. A flicker of movement caught his eye. A servitor, dragging a broken data cable through the corridor, its augmetic limbs twitching as if uncertain of their own purpose. It paused beside Alias, head tilting slightly, lenses dimming. Then, with a noise like static whispering through bone, it spoke. Signal, fading. All channels silent. Emperor, unreachable. The custodian did not answer. He only rose, his armor whispering against the stone. In that moment, he understood something the priests and politicians never would. The Emperor's light was not merely power. It was memory, the binding thread that held 10,000 years of faith and madness together. Without it, mankind would not simply lose direction, it would forget why it had ever moved forward. Alias turned toward the stairs and began his ascent. Above him, the palace groaned again. Ancient gears shifting, unseen systems awakening for the first time in millennia. Whether they stirred in defense or in mourning, he could not say. All he knew was that the light had gone out, and in its place, the darkness had begun to listen.
By the seventh day of the silence, Terra itself began to change. The great spires that pierced the smog-choked skies no longer gleamed, their golden surfaces dimmed beneath a haze that felt heavier than pollution. It was as though the world itself mourned. The tides of pilgrims that eternally flooded the causeways to the imperial palace grew wild and desperate. Men and women clawed at the gates, their prayers twisting into screams. "Return the light," they cried, voices raw, faith cracked open like glass under strain. The Adeptus Arbitus deployed shock mauls and Tyr Prometheum to maintain order, but even their discipline faltered beneath the sheer weight of terror. In the high towers of the Administratum, adepts wept over parchment decrees they could no longer deliver. Vox networks had gone silent beyond the Sol system. Astropathic relays returned only echoes, shards of voices, fragmented prayers from worlds screaming into the void. Some messages carried half words, half thoughts that were not human at all. On one transmission, a terrified astropath had burned alive mid-chant,
her skull cracking from within as she screamed that she could see the stars closing. The word closing spread like plague. It became the whisper of the Imperium's final days. In the lower manufactura, where the servitors chanted in binary hymns to keep machines alive, even the mechanicus began to falter. The flow of Prometheum shipments ceased. Orbital convoys vanished without trace. Tech priests invoked every litany of ignition they knew, but the machine spirits grew silent. Entire production lines ground to a halt, as though refusing to serve a faith they no longer felt. The Red Priests began to question, in their secret cant, whether the Omnicia had abandoned not only his throne, but the entire concept of order itself. And in the chambers of the ecclesiarchy, debate turned to dread. High lords spoke of declaring a holy reaffirmation, a crusade of purification to rekindle belief through blood. But even as they drafted their decrees, they felt it. The thinness of the air, the way the light dimmed with each passing hour. When one of the High Lords collapsed mid-session, his heart ruptured by terror, his aides swore they saw his shadow linger on the wall long after his body fell. It remained there for hours, as though unwilling to leave the world before its god did. Meanwhile, Aurelius walked the upper terraces of the palace, where statues of the emperor towered over the ruins of gardens long since turned to dust. He had not slept in 4 days. Custodians did not require rest like mortals did, but even he could feel the exhaustion building, not of body, but of soul. The silence pressed upon him, relentless and cold. From this height, he could see the curvature of Terra's horizon, the unending sprawl of humanity that had built itself upon the corpse of its own hope. Billions below, unaware of how close the edge truly was. A faint wind stirred the ash that blanketed the terraces, carrying the faintest hum of machines deep within the palace, a heartbeat still struggling against death. He paused beside a broken statue, its marble face eroded by centuries of acid rain. The inscription below it read, "By his light alone do we see." Aurelius stared at it for a long time. Then, for the first time in his existence, he closed his eyes and whispered a prayer not taught by any ecclesiarch. "If you still see us, let the light return, not for the strong, not for the pure, for those who still believe without reason." No answer came, only the faint groan of stone. But then, faint and fragile, a vibration thrummed through the air. Not light, not sound, something older, a pulse beneath the world, deep and irregular, like a dying heart struggling against stillness. It lasted 3 beats, then faded. Aurelius opened his eyes and felt the ghost of warmth against his armor. For an instant, he dared to hope. Across the void, a few surviving navigators felt it too. Their third eyes flickered open to glimpses of a distant flame, faint and broken, but there. They sent hurried messages through astropathic channels, fragments of data, promises of return. Yet when those signals reached Terra, they were unreadable, corrupted by static that sounded almost like whispering laughter. Hope, it seemed, was not alone in the dark. That night, the clouds over the imperial palace shifted. For a brief moment, the light of the Astronomicon reappeared, no longer the golden radiance of divine guidance, but a deep crimson flare that burned across the sky like a wound torn open. Every seer on Terra screamed as one. The palace trembled as though the planet itself recoiled. And then the light vanished again, leaving nothing but silence and the scent of ozone. Aurelius fell to one knee, his gauntlet pressing against the cold stone. He did not know whether what he had seen was resurrection or omen. But in that silence, he heard something he could not unhear. A whisper in a voice he had not heard in 10,000 years. It said only one word, quiet as breath, ancient as the stars. Wait. Then the world went still, and the Astronomicon, once the heart of mankind, pulsed one final time before the void took it. The first to vanish were the ships. Entire battle groups that had left Terra mere days before were swallowed whole by the void. The Gilded Saint, a grand cruiser of the Segmentum solar fleet, was among the first. Her navigators had gone blind the moment the Astronomicon faded, and her captain, Lord Commander Hester Valen, ordered the engines to half power while they awaited reconnection. The crew prayed to the Emperor for guidance, but prayer meant nothing without direction. By the third day, the ship had drifted into a warp eddy that none could chart. By the fourth, the screams began. First in the lower decks, where servitors malfunctioned and tore open the bulkheads, and then on the bridge, where the Vox officers reported whispers echoing from channels that should have been silent. No one ever received another transmission. When the Gilded Saint was finally found centuries later, she was a ghost. Her hull intact, her crew long dead, and her bridge sealed from within. The data logs were filled with only one phrase, repeated over and over. The light has gone out, but something else is watching. Across the galaxy, similar stories multiplied like infection. Vox signals twisted into static. Astropathic choirs burned out like candles. The Imperium, a civilization built upon communication and control, began to fracture at its seams. Planetary governors could no longer reach their sectors. Fleets drifted blind through the madness of the warp, guided only by superstition and desperation. Even the Adeptus Mechanicus, whose machine prayers could once bridge systems, found their transmissions hijacked by unknown code, symbols that flickered through data streams like scripture written by ghosts.
On the fortress world of Calthor Primus, General Varan of the Astra Militarum stared at the blank Vox screen in disbelief. For 3 decades he had commanded his regiment with iron discipline, but now his orders went unanswered. The last signal received from Segmentum Command was a half-broken message ending in static. Terra no longer speaks. He looked out across the trenches, miles of frozen mud and steel, lit only by the flicker of Prometheum fires. His soldiers still sang the marching hymns of the Emperor, but their voices were hollow, mechanical. Without the Astronomicon, without proof that Terra still endured, even the most loyal hearts began to falter. The chaplain assigned to the regiment, a man named Solmer, continued to preach beneath the storm, his crozius raised high, shouting that faith did not require sight. Yet when the night came, he was the first to fall silent. In the deep void between stars, the silence of the Astronomicon became a presence unto itself. Astropaths described it not as emptiness, but as something that listened. Ships attempting to send messages reported their own words returning distorted, like echoes in a vast cavern. Some captains believed the Emperor was testing them. Others began to suspect that the warp itself had turned its gaze toward them, curious now that the light which once blinded it was gone. On Mars, the data looms of the Fabricator General recorded the pattern of the silence. What they discovered should have been impossible. The warp had grown quiet, unnaturally so. Demonic incursions had not increased, they had stopped. No new entities breached reality, no voices howled from beyond. The void had become not violent, but empty. To the Mechanicus, this was blasphemy through logic. The warp without chaos was not peace, it was death. And still, the Vox channels carried faint signals, phantoms of the Astronomicon. Ships that followed them found themselves drawn to regions of the galaxy where time twisted like a broken clock, where light bent in circles, and where voices whispered from the hulls of dead vessels. Survivors spoke of seeing shapes in the dark, outlines of figures vast as cities, watching without motion, their eyes like cracks in space. Back on Terra, within the chamber of the astropathic choirs, the last living seers burned with fever as they strained to hear even the faintest echo of the Emperor's will. One young astropath, barely trained, collapsed mid-chant, her mind flooded with a vision that no one could explain. Through her cracked lips, she spoke words that the scribes transcribed in horror. He no longer calls across the void, he listens from within it. In that moment, the meaning became clear to those who dared believe it. The Emperor's light had not died, it had receded, withdrawn into some unreachable silence. Whether by choice or decay, none could say. But for the countless souls still adrift in the darkness, that distinction made no difference. For them, hope itself had lost its voice. And as the void deepened, humanity began to whisper back.
In the beginning, the whispers were dismissed as static. Vox distortion, feedback, radiation from warp storms. Anything but the truth. But as the weeks passed, it became impossible to ignore. Across the scattered remnants of the Imperium, ship captains and planetary governors began hearing the same voice, faint but unmistakably human. It never spoke in full sentences, only fragments, half prayers, half reminders. Remember the fire, hold the line, I am not gone. Some believed it was the Emperor himself speaking through the void. Others claimed it was something wearing his tone, mimicking his cadence with a perfection too cruel to be coincidence. On the prison world of Valak Ninth, where heretics once screamed the Emperor's name in agony, the overseer of the Vox Towers recorded one such transmission. It was faint, almost buried beneath waves of interference, but when amplified, the voice seemed to echo through multiple layers of reality. It said, "The throne no longer burns, the stars will judge the faithful." Moments later, every prisoner on the planet went silent. When the wardens entered their cells, they found them kneeling, eyes open and mouths filled with ash. The ecclesiaci declared these reports heresy. They ordered the execution of anyone spreading rumors of the emperor's voice, citing that the throne cannot speak where the light is absent. But the suppression only made the faithless more vocal. Cults rose overnight. The choir of the hollow, the listeners beyond the veil, the sons of the silent emperor. Each claimed to have heard the same call, each interpreting it differently. Some preached salvation through surrender, others demanded the burning of every world that still prayed to the old light. On the battle station Seraph of Mars, a group of Skitarii engineers intercepted a data stream carrying fragments of binary code that resembled the Emperor's sigils, repeated patterns long associated with the Astronomicon's harmonic field. But when they decrypted it, they found words no logic engine could have produced. Open the gates beneath Terra. The Mechanicus purged the message, disassembled the Kajitadur, and executed the adepts who had seen it. But the code had already spread. It infected machine spirits across dozens of forges, embedding itself into Vox systems like a hymn that could not be silenced. Meanwhile, the Astra Militarum fought blind. Without warp routes, the regiments became stranded across worlds they had never meant to defend. Supplies dwindled, discipline broke. On the desert world of Gathas II, a company of Cadian shock troopers refused to abandon their posts even after all communication ceased. Their commander, Captain Wren, was found weeks later, sitting in his command chair, eyes hollow, still issuing orders into a dead Vox. The transcript recovered from his command post contained his final words. He told me to wait, said he would return through the silence. Among the Adeptus Astartes, the reaction was more divided. The Ultramarines fortified their borders, refusing to act until the truth could be confirmed. The Blood Angels declared the event a test of purity and sent entire strike forces into the warp to hunt the silence. None returned. The Space Wolves, ever distrustful of faith without action, took to the void, hunting whatever they believed had devoured the Astronomicon. What they found, no one knows. The Vox logs from their flagship, the Hraffenkel's Vow, end with a single sentence. We have seen the light again, but it does not know us.
On Terra, within the echoing chambers of the Imperial Palace, Aelius listened to these reports in grim silence. His armor, dulled by sleepless days, reflected the pale light of a dying lumen globe. Every voice that reached him from beyond the palace spoke of confusion, fear, and a new presence, something vast and unseen, listening from the dark between stars. The tech priests still labored below, bleeding incense and logic into the failing machinery of the throne. The priests above still preached faith with cracked voices, but Aelius knew what they all refused to speak aloud. If the Astronomicon was gone, then the Emperor's body was no longer alone on the throne.
Something else was near it, breathing, or perhaps waiting. He turned from the Vox terminal, his reflection bending in the curved gold of his armor. The air trembled faintly, as though the palace itself exhaled. Then, through the static of every still-functioning Vox relay in the Sol system, a single word was spoken. Not by machine, not by man, but by something that existed both within and beyond. It said simply, "Endure." Then, the signal cut, leaving only silence, heavier than before. And for the first time since the Age of Strife, the Imperium realized it was alone. Weeks became months. The Imperium, once a machine of endless order and command, devolved into a chorus of isolated worlds, each speaking to ghosts, each hearing only themselves. The void was not empty, it was full of echoes, words repeated from nowhere, signals that seemed human but arrived centuries before they were sent. The laws of cause and effect, of distance and time, had begun to collapse where the Astronomicon had once anchored them. The warp was no longer a storm, it was a mirror, reflecting humanity's voice back in broken tones. On the forge world of Agrippina, the machine priests watched the skies with fear they dared not name. They heard transmissions that no cogitator could process, machine voices that spoke in human rhythm, prayers recited backward, static that carried the cadence of the imperial creed. The senior magi concluded that the void itself had begun to remember the Imperium, replaying fragments of its own faith like a malfunctioning archive. They called it data echo resonance, but those few who still believed whispered another name for it: the Emperor's recoil, the echo of his withdrawal, the universe replaying the sound of his silence. On 1,000 worlds, strange phenomena took root. Voxcasters that had lain dormant began to hum without power. Servo skulls drifted through streets whispering fragments of liturgies they had never been programmed to know. Even the relics of saints began to vibrate faintly, as though trying to speak. The ecclesiarchy called them miracles. The Mechanicus called them contamination. But the people, those forgotten billions who had never seen the stars, called them proof.
One of these miracles occurred on the mining world of Torvis Reach. Deep beneath the permafrost, in the shattered remains of an ancient data vault, a signal began transmitting through every device simultaneously. It was not words, not music, but rhythm, a heartbeat, slow and immense. The miners fell to their knees, convinced it was the Emperor's pulse echoing through the world. For 7 days it continued. On the 8th, the planet's core ruptured, consuming the colony in molten fire. The Vox recorders captured one final sound before disintegration, a voice, faint but unmistakable. You dug too deep into memory. And so, fear became doctrine. The Holy Synod of Terra declared that any signal not authorized by the Adeptus Astropha Telepathica was to be considered warp corruption. But it made no difference. The signals did not ask for permission. They arrived in dreams, in flickering lumen lights, in the whispers of children, speaking words they could not understand. They came from every direction, from every silence. The galaxy had begun to talk back. Alias received reports daily, each more impossible than the last. Fleets attempting to retrace known routes vanished into corridors of unlight. Astropathic choirs that once carried the Emperor's will now screamed verses of scripture in reverse. Even the Ordo Hereticus grew afraid, for the boundaries between faith and madness had dissolved. One inquisitor, Aerith Thol, sent a final encrypted message to Terra before purging his ship's crew. The Astronomicon is not gone, it has inverted. Its light burns inward. We are seeing the reflection of the Emperor looking back through himself. His transmission ended with the sound of weeping metal and a single human sigh. The High Lords tried to restore order. They issued decrees, staged public processions, declared a new holiday of faith,
the day of endurance. Billions gathered across Terra to pray as one, their voices echoing up to the heavens. For a moment, even the sky above them seemed to shimmer with their devotion. Then the stars above them flickered, not in unison, not in beauty, but in Morse-like rhythm. When decoded, the pattern formed a single repeated phrase: "Who remembers me now?" Panic tore through the crowd. Riots erupted in the ecclesiarchal quarter, fires devouring the basilicas built in the emperor's image. The Adeptus Arbites opened fire, but even their bullets could not drown the chant that began to rise from the pilgrims. The same words the stars had whispered, repeated over and over until it became indistinguishable from prayer. Aelius watched from the upper parapets of the palace, his visor reflecting the inferno below. The smell of burning incense and flesh carried on the wind, mingling into one indistinguishable smoke. He had guarded the emperor's still form for nearly 1,000 years. He had seen every heresy, every war, every crusade, but never this, the moment faith itself began to turn against its own source. He reached up, removing his helm. The air of Terra was bitter and dry, filled with ash and static. Somewhere in the distance, a thunderstorm gathered over the ruins of the ecclesiarchal dome. Lightning arced across the horizon, striking the Aquila spires and fracturing them like glass. The power grids failed, and the entire world plunged into shadow. And in that perfect dark, the Vox systems of Terra crackled once more. Every frequency, every device, every channel alive with a single sound. The slow, deliberate intake of breath. No one spoke. Not the priests, not the soldiers, not the custodians. Then the breath became a whisper. One word, quiet as dying light. Soon. Aelius closed his eyes. For the first time he felt fear, not for himself, but for the meaning of that word. Because in a galaxy without the Emperor's light, soon could mean salvation or something far worse. The corridors of the imperial palace had always been silent, but now that silence had changed. It was not the reverent quiet of ritual, nor the disciplined stillness of order. It was the stillness of something holding its breath. The air itself seemed to listen. The great banners of the emperor hung unmoving despite the drafts that whispered through the halls. The lumen globes flickered in long intervals, as though uncertain if they should shine. In that half-light, the gold of the custodes no longer gleamed. It looked tarnished, dimmed to the hue of old blood. Aelius moved through the shadowed colonnades without escort. His footfalls echoed off marble floors polished by centuries of devotion. Every archway was a mouth of prayer, every door sealed with sigils meant to keep despair at bay. He passed the statues of his brothers, custodians long dead, their likenesses carved in perfect stillness, faces turned toward the unseen throne. He had stood among them once in the living flesh, shoulder to shoulder, sworn to defend a god who had no voice. Now they watched him with stone eyes that seemed to ask the question he could not answer. What does a guardian protect when there is nothing left to guard? He descended through layers of the palace that few living beings had seen in centuries. The air grew colder, heavy with the scent of oil and ancient dust. Servitors lined the walls, frozen mid-ritual, their eyes dark. The humming of the throne's machinery, once omnipresent, had dwindled to a faint pulse, a slow rhythm, like the breath of a dying titan. Aelius could feel it through the soles of his boots, deep beneath the marble, as though the planet itself was remembering how to die. In the sanctum below the sanctum, he found the Magos Dominus Erathos once more, though the man had changed. His flesh had thinned to wire and tubing, his face little more than a lattice of augmetics and bone. He stood before a flickering data altar,
his mechadendrites twitching as they scrawled equations across the air. "You should not be here," the Magos said, his voice a stuttering modulator tone. "The systems are in decline. There is no safety here."
Alias said nothing. He only approached the altar, his reflection bending in the brass casing of its sacred surface. Lines of code scrolled endlessly, measurements of psychic decay, failing energy levels, feedback loops that no one dared interrupt. At the center of the screen, a single pulse waveform repeated every 37 seconds. It was faint, irregular, but unmistakably organic. "It lives still," Erithos whispered. "But the pattern is wrong. The waveform bleeds into frequencies no machine can record. It is not a heartbeat. It is something remembering how to beat." Alias stared at the pattern. He could feel its rhythm in his own chest, like a shadow heartbeat sinking to his own. For the briefest moment, he thought he heard something beyond the static, a whisper too low for sound, but heavy with intent. It was not language, yet he understood. The Emperor was not gone. He was turning inward, folding upon himself, drawing the last of his radiance into something deeper than flesh or machine. Erithos noticed his stillness. "You hear it too," the Magus murmured. "We all do. The machine spirits of the throne hum in resonance. Even the dormant servitors twitch when it speaks. It is not communication. It is communion. The Emperor is reconfiguring. Or dying," Alias said quietly. The Magus turned his head sharply, the servos in his neck screeching. "That word has no meaning here. He does not die. He changes state." "Then what is he becoming?" Erithos's eyes, two red lenses reflecting the pulse waveform, dimmed slightly. "I do not know, but I have begun to dream." The words hung in the air like heresy. A Magus Dominus did not dream. Their minds were half machine, stripped of such weakness. Yet Erithos trembled as he spoke. "In my rest cycles, I see the golden throne not as it is, but as it was before, newly forged, bright as the dawn. But the figure seated upon it is not man or god. It is a void wrapped in gold, and within it, something grows. I wake screaming binary prayers, but the vision remains." Alias said nothing. He only turned toward the sealed adamantine door that led to the throne chamber. The light that seeped through the cracks was weaker than ever, barely more than a glow. He felt the pulse again, slow, ponderous, uncertain. For the first time in his endless vigil, he wondered whether the Emperor still recognized those who guarded him. The silence pressed harder now. It was no longer absence. It was attention. Something vast and unseen lingered just beyond perception, watching both man and machine. He could feel it behind the walls, within the hum of cables, in the faint tremor of the air. And then, from deep within the throne's machinery, came a sound. A single, long exhale of static, as though the palace itself sighed. Alias looked back at the Magos. What was that? Erithos's voice trembled. It was the sound of something waking, or something remembering how to. The exhalation spread through the palace like a breath drawn by a god. The walls shuddered, the lumen strips flickered to life, and for one terrible instant the air felt alive, thick with the pulse of something vast and half-remembered. Alias felt it deep within his armor, the vibration thrumming through the ceramite as though the gold itself recognized its maker. All around him, servitors twitched back to movement, their mouths opening in voiceless prayer. The Magos Dominus fell to his knees, augmetic limbs convulsing, reciting the litany of rebirth through gritted metal teeth. And then it passed. The light dimmed once more, leaving only echoes.
Alias stood in the afterglow of that moment, breath held, the scent of ozone and blood mingling in the air. He turned his gaze toward the sealed gate of the throne chamber. He had stood before it countless times, but now it seemed different, heavier, older, as though aware of him. For the first time in his long life, the custodian felt that the gate itself was listening. Arathos rose slowly, his mechadendrites twitching erratically. It reacted. Not to me, to you. Alias said nothing. His hand, gloved in auramite, hovered an inch from the seal of the gate. Warmth radiated from the metal, a slow, rhythmic heat that pulsed like a living heartbeat. He could hear it, deep, uneven, but undeniably there. The throne, once silent, was breathing again. The Magos began recording, data streams pouring across the altar. He said, "The waveform has altered. Frequency increased. Energy bleed is now cyclical, not degenerative. This is not entropy. This is transition." Transition to what? Alias asked quietly. Arathos's lenses flickered. Perhaps communication.
The word hung in the chamber like a challenge. Elias's hand pressed against the seal. The heat flared. The throne pulsed once more, harder this time. He staggered back, a sound rising through the walls, not mechanical, not organic, but something between. It was not a word. It was intention. The floor beneath him quaked. Dust fell from the golden vaults above. The throne's conduits, those great veins that carried power and essence through the palace, lit with dull crimson light, spreading outward like arteries awakening after centuries of stillness. Arathos shouted something in technolingua, but the words dissolved in static. Alias turned toward the altar screen. The waveform that had once been erratic now pulsed with perfect rhythm. Each beat came slower, heavier, until the chamber itself seemed to match its cadence. The custodian realized, with a chill that reached through the armor to his bones, that the pattern was no longer random. It was mimicking his own heartbeat. Arathos stared, transfixed. "It's synchronizing," he whispered. "The Emperor's pattern, aligning with yours." Alias felt it then, a presence pressing against his mind. Not speech, not vision, but a weight, immense and silent. It was not the psychic clarity of the Emperor's will as he had once known it. This was raw, unfiltered awareness. It did not command, it observed. It looked through him, through his armor, through his soul, and found something worth remembering. The custodian dropped to one knee, not out of worship, but out of necessity. His breath came ragged, his vision swimming with gold and shadow. Images flickered through his mind, glimpses of a burning galaxy, ships adrift in endless night, men and women kneeling before broken altars. He saw the Astronomicon, dimmed and pulsing like a dying sun, then folding inward into a point of black light. And from within that darkness, a voice, not heard but felt, rose like the sound of a distant tide. "I am not gone." Alias gasped. The chamber returned to silence. The lights faded. The warmth vanished. The Magus rushed forward, his servos hissing. "What did you hear?" "Nothing," Alias said, though his voice shook. But the Magus was not deceived. "It touched you. You are linked. The waveform responds to your presence." The custodian turned toward the gate once more, his reflection glimmering faintly in its gilded surface. "Then what does it want?" The Magus did not answer immediately. His voice, when it came, was quiet and full of awe. "Perhaps to be remembered." The words lingered long after the Magus departed,
his servitors carrying data slates heavy with unspoken blasphemy. Aelius remained alone before the throne, the golden doors vast and unmoving.
Outside, terror trembled beneath storms that had no origin. The people prayed harder, their voices rising into the black skies, but even their prayers sounded hollow, stretched thin by distance and despair. The silence from the heavens was no longer absence, it was reply. Aelius laid a hand on his chest. His heart still beat. The emperor's pulse had matched his own. And somewhere in the deep dark between those two rhythms, something ancient had awakened, a bond between God and guardian, memory and flesh. He whispered into the quiet, not expecting an answer. "If you can hear me, guide me." Far above, lightning struck the palace spire. The sky burned gold for one fleeting moment, and though no sound followed, Aelius could have sworn he heard the faintest echo of words not yet spoken. Then listen. When morning came, if such a word still held meaning on Terra, the palace was quieter than ever. The dawn light filtered weakly through the high vaults of the Sanctum Imperialis, pale and thin, as though even the sun feared to intrude. The custodians had gathered at last, their golden armor dulled beneath the haze, forming ranks of silent giants before the sealed throne room. No orders had been given, none were needed. Every one of them had felt it, the breath in the night, the pulse beneath the world, the whisper that might have been their god. Aelius stood at the head of the formation, his halberd planted into the marble floor, the haft trembling faintly in his grip. He was the oldest among them now, a relic of a time when the emperor's gaze had still lingered, faint but constant, in the minds of his chosen. He had lived to see the light of Terra dim and the faith of men become ritual. But this was something else. This was not decay. It was change. One of his brothers, Custodian Vaughn, broke formation. His voice, deep and calm, echoed through the hall. "The emperor lives. I feel him stirring." His words were reverent, almost pleading. Another answered, his tone sharp with disbelief. "We all felt something, but we do not know what it was." "The light may have gone," Vaughn said, turning to face them. "But what if this silence is not death? What if he is returning to speak again, not through flame, but through stillness?" "Silence is not speech. It is absence," another custodian muttered. Aelius listened without interrupting. His eyes, pale as frost beneath his helm, drifted toward the sealed gate. He could still feel the faint warmth in his chest, that strange shared rhythm. It called to him, soft but insistent. Then, without command, the gates began to hum. The sound was low, almost imperceptible at first, a vibration that trembled through the bones of the palace. Every custodian turned as one. The adamantine doors, vast as cathedral walls, shimmered with faint golden light. The sigils engraved upon them, wardings older than empires, flared once and went dark. Balin stepped forward, falling to his knees. "He answers," he whispered. But Aelius did not kneel. He watched, motionless, as the light ebbed and flowed, pulsing like a slow heartbeat. The air thickened, charged with static, and a faint whisper seemed to crawl across the stone. It was not sound. It was thought. "Remember." The custodians stood transfixed. Some whispered the emperor's name, others wept quietly, unashamed. But Aelius felt something deeper, an unease that moved beneath reverence. The pulse he had felt before now grew stronger, pressing against his armor, his mind, his very soul. It was no longer a whisper. It was recognition. The doors did not open. They did not need to. Through that sealed barrier, Aelius felt the throne, its heat, its weight, its hunger. There was life within that chamber, but it was not the life of the emperor as he had known him. It was something vaster, quieter, more ancient.
The golden throne had ceased to contain. It had begun to become. He turned to the others. "Step back." The custodians hesitated. None had authority over another, for they were each the emperor's will made flesh. But in that moment, something in Aelius's tone compelled obedience. The others retreated to the edges of the hall, leaving him alone before the gates. He approached, slowly, until he could feel the hum against his skin. The gold beneath his gauntlet was warm, not burning, but alive. Alive in a way that should not be possible for metal. It vibrated faintly beneath his touch, as if breathing. "You have guarded him for 10,000 years," said a voice, though there was no one near. It came from the walls, from the floor, from within his own mind. "You stood between the god and the void. Now the void speaks. Will you listen?" Aelius's throat tightened. He wanted to answer, but words failed him. "Do you fear what you will hear?" the voice asked. He closed his eyes. "I fear silence."
There was a pause, long, heavy, endless. Then came a single word, a whisper that felt like it came from everywhere at once. "Then speak." The light beneath his hand flared, searing bright. Visions burst through him, memories not his own. He saw Terra in its golden age, before the wars, before the throne. He saw the emperor walking among men, not as a god but as a man. He felt the weight of a promise, the burden of guardianship, the faith of a dying species clinging to light. And then he saw the truth. The throne was not failing, it was consuming, drawing in all that remained of its maker, turning divinity into something else, something vast, unknowable, eternal. The emperor was not dying, he was becoming memory itself. The light faded. Aelius fell to his knees, gasping. His armor smoked from within. The Ormites scalded where he had touched the gate. The other custodians rushed forward, but he raised a hand to stop them. His voice trembled. "He remembers us." They stared in silence. Aelius looked back at the sealed chamber, eyes wide with something between reverence and terror. "But memory," he whispered, "is not mercy." Far above, lightning split the clouds over Terra once more. The emperor was no longer silent. He was listening back. Across the Imperium, the echoes began. No one could trace their origin. They did not travel through Vox, nor through the warp, nor through any mechanism known to the Mechanicus. They simply appeared, spoken into the air of ships, whispered through cathedral walls, murmured from the mouths of sleeping children. The words changed from world to world, but the tone was always the same, calm, distant, unanswerable. Some heard commands, others confessions. A few heard only their own names, spoken with unbearable gentleness. On the shrine world of Ophelia VII, a congregation gathered for the liturgy of the lightless dawn. In the middle of the chant, every torch in the basilica extinguished at once. The silence that followed was absolute, save for the soft echo of a voice that did not come from any throat. "You made me what you needed. Now I become what you fear." The priests collapsed where they stood, their faith burned away in an instant. The next day, the basilica was found empty. Its great stone saints had melted into smooth glass, their faces erased. On the void stations orbiting Mars, the machine spirits began to hum hymns no one had programmed. Data streams twisted into patterns that mirrored human speech. When translated by the Magi, they formed words that chilled even their binary hearts. "He speaks through silence. Do you not hear the pattern between the noise?" The Mechanicus debated this for days, their logic fracturing. Some declared it proof that the Omisia was revealing his final equation. Others said it was a virus, a psychic infection born of human despair. The Fabricator General himself sealed the archives and issued one decree: no longer transmit prayers,
only observe. Yet observation brought no clarity. In the void, derelict ships began to drift toward one another, drawn by unseen forces. Their vox arrays sparked to life, sending fragments of light through the warp. The navigators who witnessed it wept, for the pattern those lights formed was not random. It was the symbol of the imperial Aquila, broken, inverted, then consumed by darkness. Aelius learned of these phenomena from Erithos, whose voice now trembled with something close to awe. "It is spreading," the Magos said. "Every system reports the same phenomenon. The throne is radiating frequencies no longer bound by time or matter. It is as if the Emperor's essence is bleeding outward, fragmenting into echoes. They do not travel as sound or thought. They simply are." Aelius stood beside the Magos in the observatory of the upper sanctum, watching the storms tear across Terra's sky. "Then the Emperor's light has returned?" Erithos shook his head. "No, this is not light. It is reflection. The memory of light replaying itself through everything that ever believed in him." Outside, the heavens pulsed with faint rhythmic illumination, flashes of gold and crimson that shimmered through the smog. The Astronomicon, or what remained of it, had begun to flicker again, but its pulse no longer matched the Emperor's heart. It was fractured, unpredictable, like the afterimage of a dying sun burned into the eyes of the cosmos. From that radiance, voices bled into the minds of those attuned to faith. Some wept, some went mad, others began to preach new doctrines. On the hive world of Vastor, the ecclesiarchy was overthrown overnight by its own preachers, who claimed to have heard the emperor laugh. On the frontier planet of Juno, a single guardsman emerged from a battle thought lost, his armor glowing faintly with gold. When questioned, he said he had seen the emperor, not as man or god, but as a shadow of light moving through fire, and that the shadow had whispered, "Do not build me higher, build yourselves." For the first time in history, faith began to divide not over interpretation, but over contact. Every world heard something different. Every sect believed it alone understood. The unity of belief, the one truth that had held humanity together through endless war, fractured like glass.
In the throne room, Aelius felt those echoes pass through him like ripples through still water. Each pulse brought memories that were not his own, faces of men and women he had never known, dying in the Emperor's name, whispering prayers to a light they would never see. He realized, with a sudden clarity that hollowed him out, that these were not visions granted by a god. They were fragments of humanity's faith reflected back upon itself. The Emperor had become a mirror, endless, omnipresent, indifferent. The Magos trembled beside him. "It is too much," Erithos murmured. "The signal saturates all channels. The flesh cannot endure this kind of resonance." His augmetic sparked, circuits smoking, but still he stared upward transfixed. "Do you understand, custodian? We are hearing the last conversation between man and his god." Aelius turned his gaze toward the sealed chamber, feeling once more that pulse behind the door, stronger now, heavier, as though something vast pressed against the boundary of existence. "No," he said softly, "we are not hearing the end, we are hearing the answer." The throne chamber shuttered. The light returned, brief, blinding, eternal for the space of a breath. And somewhere, across the infinite dark, the Astronomicon pulsed once more, one long, resonant flare that reached every soul who had ever whispered the Emperor's name. It was not salvation, it was remembrance. The flare of light swept through the void like a memory refusing to die. It touched worlds that had long been severed from Terra, places where humanity had forgotten the shape of the imperial aquila, where the name of the emperor was little more than a curse whispered to ward off fear. And yet, in that single radiant pulse, even they felt it, the unmistakable weight of remembrance pressing against their hearts. Children woke screaming, whispering words in languages they had never learned. Machine spirits sang fragments of hymns that had not been voiced in 10 millennia. Across 1,000 battlefields, dying soldiers opened their eyes and smiled, as if someone unseen had taken their hand. On Terra, the pulse hit like a storm. The palace trembled, the air vibrated with low, resonant thunder. The custodians fell to one knee as instinct rather than devotion. Aelius felt his armor grow warm, the Oramite plates alive with energy, as though remembering what they had once been forged for, to stand between man and the unknowable. From the depths of the throne, the voice came again, not in sound, but in thought that transcended all barriers of flesh and steel. It spoke through memory, through blood, through the sacred architecture of faith itself. You built me from your fear. You crowned me with your need. I gave you light, and you mistook it for command.
Aelius felt the words burn through his mind like molten gold. Around him, the custodians began to tremble, their composure fracturing under the sheer weight of the message. It was not anger. It was not judgment. It was truth, and it was unbearable. The Magos Dominus Arethos clung to his altar of cables and glowing data slates, his mechanical voice a trembling hymn of disbelief. Impossible! This cannot be consciousness! No signal can... The words died as the entire palace flooded with light. Every lumen, every cogitator, every relic flared to life, their systems synchronized in a single rhythm. Even the statues of long-dead heroes seemed to breathe, their shadows writhing across the walls like souls awakening after endless sleep. Through it all, the voice continued, patient and vast. You think me dying. You think me bound. But I am not where you placed me. I am where you believe me to be. I am faith turned inward. I am what endures when the flesh forgets itself. Arethos dropped to his knees, tears of oil streaming down his face. O Nysia, forgive me. We never worshipped you. We only built cages for the divine. Aelius could barely stand. The pulse within the throne had grown deafening, not in sound, but in sensation. Each wave of it carried visions, not of triumph, but of reflection. He saw the emperor walking among humanity as he once had. No crown, no halo, no worshippers, only eyes filled with sorrow at what his creations had made of his dream. He saw worlds burning in his name, temples raised upon the bones of the faithful, children taught to fear the silence rather than listen to it. And then he saw the Astronomicon as it truly was, a wound in the fabric of reality, a beacon not of light, but of hunger, feeding on devotion to sustain itself. The realization struck him like a spear. The emperor's power had never been the source of the light. It had been the reflection of 10,000 years of human need. The beacon was humanity's collective prayer, and now that faith was unraveling, the mirror was turning inward. Do you understand now? The voice whispered, softer than before, intimate as breath against the ear. I was never the flame. You were. And now that you are fading, so too must I. The golden glow began to recede. The air grew cold once more. The pulse slowed, steady and final,
like a tide pulling back into an infinite sea. Erethos collapsed, his augmetics twitching weakly. The waveform, stabilizing, entropy reversing. His voice cracked into static. He's becoming memory. Alias moved forward toward the sealed gates, each step heavier than the last. "If you fade," he said aloud, his voice echoing through the vast chamber, "then what becomes of us?"
There was no reply, only the faint hum of machinery. But as the light faded entirely, leaving only the dim red glow of emergency lumen strips, Alias heard a final whisper, a thought that lingered in the air like a benediction and a warning both. "What you call me was never my name. Carry what remains." The throne fell silent. Outside, the storms over Terra dispersed, leaving a sky eerily clear for the first time in centuries. The Astronomicon no longer burned, yet faint threads of light still moved across the heavens, ghostly and weak. The void had not devoured humanity after all. It merely waited, listening to see what sound they would make next. Alias turned to the Magus, who lay dying beside his altar, circuits dimming one by one. "What now?" the custodian asked. Erethos looked up, half-human lips curling into something between a smile and a prayer. "Now," he rasped, "we learn what it means to live without being watched." And as his final breath left him, the palace shuddered one last time. The throne was still. But in that stillness, somewhere deep within the heart of Terra, something vast and unseen stirred, neither god nor machine, but the residue of both, waiting for the echo of its own rebirth. The stillness that followed was almost unbearable. It was the kind of silence that seemed to erase sound rather than lack it. Elias stood in the afterglow, surrounded by custodians who dared not move, their halberds trembling in hands that had never known fear. The Magus's body lay motionless beside the altar, his mechanical limbs twitching once, then falling still. Above them, the last sparks of golden light spiraled upward like embers from a dying fire, fading into the vaulted dark. And then came the echoes. They began as murmurs at the edge of hearing, snatches of phrases, fragments of songs, words spoken by a billion voices across a million worlds, but they did not come from the void. They came through it, weaving together, resonating as one. Alias felt them vibrate inside his chest, not as sound, but as memory. Each word belonged to someone who had once prayed to the emperor, a soldier whispering a death vow, a mother begging for her child's survival, a child reciting a catechism in the dark. All of it returning now, as if the universe itself were playing back the sound of its devotion before letting it go.
"He was never gone," one voice whispered. "He was always waiting." "He sees us still," said another. "He has forgotten," murmured a third, soft as grief. The voices overlapped, layered into something vast and terrible and beautiful. For a moment, it sounded like the hum of the Astronomicon returned, but deeper, older, drawn not from light but from remembrance. And in that trembling chorus, Elias realized the truth that none of them had dared speak. The emperor was not fading, he was diffusing. The divine essence that had once been bound to one body, one throne, was now unraveling through the warp, dissolving into the infinite minds that had believed in him. The emperor was becoming the sum of his worshippers, the godhood of humanity scattered across itself. He turned to his brothers, their faces hidden behind gilded helms. "Do you feel it?" he asked, his voice raw. One nodded. "It is everywhere, within and without,
as if he walks inside the breath of every living thing. Another whispered, "Is this salvation or dissolution?" Neither could answer. The air grew heavy again, not with sound but with presence. It pressed down upon the palace like gravity, bending the light, warping the air until even the marble seemed to weep molten tears. Elias knelt, overwhelmed not by fear but by the vastness of it, the incomprehensible enormity of what the emperor had become. He felt as though he stood beneath the gaze of something no longer bound by form or faith, something that remembered everything and forgave nothing. "You wished for eternity," said the voice, not spoken, but carved directly into the marrow of the world. "But eternity remembers every cry, every war, every plea made in my name. They are written into me, and now you will see what remembrance means."
Visions struck like lightning. Elias saw the galaxy not as it was, but as it had been. Before the Crusades, before the heresies, before the throne. He saw humanity reaching for the stars, united not by worship, but by curiosity and hope. He saw the emperor walking among them, faceless, countless, a million fragments of one will, guiding humanity not as a shepherd leads sheep, but as fire lights the way through night. Then, slowly, that fire was caged by devotion, by fear, by the desperate need for certainty, until all that was left was the golden corpse on the throne. Now the cage was breaking. The visions dissolved, leaving Elias gasping, armor steaming from the heat of revelation. The custodians around him staggered, each one trembling beneath the same unseen weight. Some cried out in reverence, others in despair. Outside the palace, the transformation had already begun. On worlds far from Terra, those sensitive to the warp began to glow faintly, eyes burning with gold. Astropaths who had lost their gift now spoke again, not with messages from the Imperium, but with words that no human tongue had ever shaped. On the Forge worlds, the machine priests fell silent as their data shrines filled with soft, rhythmic light. Pulses of energy matching the same impossible pattern that beat through the throne. The galaxy itself seemed to breathe. On Terra, the great Vox towers flickered back to life, transmitting a single frequency on every band. It carried no sound, no words, no image. Only a steady, resonant pulse, a heartbeat, the same that Elias had felt through the floor of the throne chamber, the same that now echoed in every soul that still believed. He rose slowly, exhaustion radiating through his frame, the pulse synchronized with his breath, with his thought, with his being. He understood now, this was not death, this was dissemination. The emperor was dissolving into myth, not as loss, but as permanence. No longer bound to body or throne, he had become something greater. Every prayer, every memory, every act of faith woven into the living fabric of the species he had once ruled. Elias looked to his brothers. Their armor, once radiant gold, now shimmered with faint internal light. "We were his guardians," he said. "Now we are his echoes." They bowed their heads as one, and the sound of their armor moving became like the shifting of mountains. The throne was silent once more, its light extinguished. But Elias understood now that it did not need to burn. Its radiance was no longer contained within walls of gold. It moved in the breath of men, the whisper of storms, the pulse of machines. It was everywhere and nowhere. And in that vast, quiet understanding, Elias finally felt peace. For the first time since the dawn of the Imperium, the Emperor of mankind was free. For a time that could not be measured in hours or days, only by the rhythm of a pulse echoing through the fabric of reality, the galaxy lay in suspension. No new orders came from Terra. No fleets launched from the forges. No choirs sang from the depths of the Adeptus Astrana Telepathica. Yet nothing truly ceased. The Imperium, that ancient colossus of ritual and ruin, continued to move, not by command, but by inertia, like a body whose heart still beats after the mind has died. Aelius stood at the highest spire of the imperial palace, where the storms once gathered and tore at the heavens. Now the sky was clear, unnaturally so. The clouds had vanished, leaving behind a void of black so pure it seemed to hum. The stars burned faintly, their light no longer drowned by the Astronomicon's blaze. For the first time in 10,000 years, Terra could see the galaxy as it truly was, cold, endless, and vast beyond reckoning. Below him, the surface of the world shimmered with faint phosphorescence. Entire cities pulsed with golden veins of light, weaving through the ruins like blood returning to long-dead flesh. The people of Terra had awakened to something they could not name. No decree had been issued, no proclamation of faith renewed, yet all across the planet, humanity moved as one organism, rediscovering its breath. Some called it a miracle, others called it the end. Aelius had no name for it. He only knew that the throne had fallen silent, and yet he still felt its rhythm within him. The Emperor's pulse, steady, deliberate, infinite, beat in his chest like a second heart. It no longer commanded, it coexisted. From the shadows behind him came the measured tread of armored feet. Valn approached, helm under his arm, face solemn and pale in the golden light. "The High Lords have withdrawn to the inner chambers," he said quietly. "They argue without words now. None dare speak aloud what all of them know." "That he is gone?" Aelius said. Valn shook his head. "That he is everywhere." The words hung in the air between them. Aelius turned his gaze toward the horizon, where the first artificial dawn of Terra began to rise. The manufactory had reignited without instruction. The forge fires burned clean and blue. The servitors moved in patterns that no human hand had coded, constructing symbols of gold and light upon the ground. Spirals, not aquillas.
"Something guides them," Valn said. "The Magi call it residual psychic imprint. The priests call it rapture. I do not know what to call it." "Faith," Aelius murmured, "the kind that does not need command." He closed his eyes and listened. The world was no longer silent. He could hear the hum of life everywhere, the low chant of pilgrims gathering in the ruins, the mechanical murmurs of servitors rebuilding cathedrals without purpose, the whispers of children describing dreams of a man without a face who walked through light. It was as if humanity itself had begun to remember what it had once been before it built its God into a prison of gold. For the first time in memory, the custodian allowed himself to remove his armor. Piece by piece, he unsealed the aramite, laying each plate upon the marble beside him until he stood only in the underrobe of crimson and black. The night air touched his skin like the breath of an old friend. The armor had once been his oath, his identity. Now it felt like a relic of an age that had already ended. He turned to Valn. "Tell me, what becomes of us if there is no throne to guard?" Valn hesitated. "Perhaps we are to guard what he left behind." "And what is that?" Valn's gaze drifted toward the endless horizon. "Ourselves." Aelius almost smiled. The answer was not comforting, but it was true. For all their divine purpose, all their forged perfection, they had never truly lived. They had served. Now, at the twilight of all things, they were being asked to live for the first time. He looked upward. Beyond the atmosphere, the void shimmered faintly. Something moved among the stars, slow, deliberate, radiant. For a moment he thought it was a fleet, but the shape was wrong. It was light itself, coalescing into an outline vast beyond imagination. A human form, but too immense for flesh, too distant for faith. A figure woven from the scattered fragments of 1,000,000,000 souls, looking down upon the galaxy with no eyes, yet infinite sight. And then it spoke, not in words, but in the quiet comprehension that filled the space between atoms. I am no longer your God. I am your witness. Elias fell to his knees, not in worship, but in awe. The form dissolved, dispersing into filaments of gold that streaked across the stars, seeding them like embers from a divine fire cast into the void. Each ember found a world, a heart, a memory.
The Emperor had not died. He had transformed into something humanity could no longer worship, only emulate. Thou looked to Elias, eyes wet with light. Will he ever return? Elias watched as the last trace of gold faded into the black. He never left, he said. We were simply deaf to the silence that spoke. Below them, Terra shimmered like a candle seen through tears. The manufactoria sang with the sound of hammers. The people prayed not to the sky, but to one another. And somewhere, deep within the ruins of the palace, beneath the throne that no longer glowed, a new pulse began to beat, soft, tentative, human. The Emperor's work was done. The galaxy's was just beginning. Night fell across Terra, though the word no longer meant what it once did. The old rhythms, sunrise, sunset, the mechanical sequence of artificial dawns and enforced curfews had been replaced by a deeper pulse, a living rhythm that ran through the world itself. The people no longer looked upward in fear or supplication. They looked inward, into the silence that filled their dreams, into the warmth that lingered behind their ribs like an ember that refused to die. Elias walked the empty corridors of the palace one last time. The air was still thick with the ghosts of incense and sanctified oil, but the machinery was silent. The echo of his footsteps was the only sound left in the hall where generations of custodians had stood watch. The statues of his fallen brothers seemed to breathe now, their carved eyes softer, their expressions no longer frozen in duty, but at rest. The throne's chamber loomed beyond the final gate, its seals broken, its light extinguished. He crossed the threshold without hesitation. The golden throne was dead. The vast machinery that had once howled with divine fire was nothing more than cooling metal and glass. The conduits that had pulsed with warp light lay dark, the veins of energy now stilled. At the center of it all sat the hollow shell of the Emperor. What had once been flesh, long since reduced to shimmering dust within the armor that had housed a god. The air shimmered faintly around the seat, alive with residual warmth, the faint scent of ozone and sanctity. It was not absence that lingered there, but completion.
He knelt, not in prayer, not in submission, but in remembrance. Lord of mankind, he said softly, his voice carrying through the stillness like the memory of wind, your watch is over. Ours begins. Something moved within the silence, an echo, a breath that was not air but awareness. It brushed against his mind,
gentle as a hand upon his shoulder. There were no words, but the meaning was clear. You have learned. He bowed his head. We were blind. You were faithful. And now you are free. He opened his eyes. The throne was empty. The dust within the armor had vanished, carried away by a breeze that had no origin. Only the faint shimmer of gold remained, swirling like light refracted through tears. It drifted past him, upward, dispersing into the cracks of the broken ceiling until it merged with the night behind. When he rose, he found Valen waiting at the threshold. The younger custodian stood unhelmed, his face illuminated by the faint auric glow that now emanated from the floor beneath their feet. It's begun, Valen said quietly. What has? The awakening, across the planet. The people dream as one. The astropaths hear songs instead of screams. The warp listens. Aurelius nodded. He had felt it too. The warp itself, once chaos incarnate, now trembling like an ocean learning to remember stillness. The Emperor's dissolution had not banished the storm, but transformed it. Faith had rewritten the madness into meaning, turned terror into reflection. Humanity was no longer a victim of the void, it had become a voice within it. Do they understand? He asked.
Valen hesitated. Not yet, but they will. The two custodians stood in silence, watching the faint luminescence crawl up the walls, threads of living gold tracing the veins of the palace. It was no divine fire, no holy radiance. It was life itself, reasserting its right to exist. Aurelius turned once more to the empty throne. He was never meant to be eternal, he said. We made him so because we feared what came after. Valen's eyes followed his. And what comes after? Aurelius smiled faintly. Us. They walked together into the open air. The wind of Terra's rebirth met them, warm, electric, carrying the scent of renewal rather than decay. The sky above was scattered with stars, their light unfiltered, pure. Among them shimmered faint threads of gold, drifting between constellations like trails of memory. For the first time since the birth of the Imperium, there was no astronomicon, no holy radiance. It was life itself, reasserting its right to exist. He looked at Valen. Do you hear it? Valen nodded. The pulse? No, Aurelius said softly. The quiet. For millennia, humanity had filled the void with noise, orders, prayers, wars, desperate cries to a God who could no longer answer. Now the silence had weight, gravity, intention. It was not emptiness, it was possibility. In the months that followed, the Imperium changed, not through decree, but through evolution. The ecclesiarchy fractured, its temples repurposed into schools and sanctuaries. The Adeptus Mechanicus turned their engines toward restoration rather than replication. The Astra Militarum laid down their banners, uncertain whom they served, and found purpose instead in protecting rather than conquering. No one commanded this. It simply happened, as if the memory of godhood lingering in every mind had rewritten the logic of survival.
The custodians disbanded. Aurelius walked beyond the palace gates for the first time in his life, unarmored, unarmed. He walked among the people, tall, scarred, radiant in a quiet way that drew reverence without demand. Some knelt before him. He lifted them to their feet. Stand, he told them. He would not want you to bow. And as he walked, he began to understand the truth of it all. The Emperor had not died for humanity. Humanity had created him to understand itself, to reach beyond its fear. Now that the lesson was learned, the divinity had no more use. The light had returned not to the sky, but to the soul.
On the 1000th day since the silence began, Aelius returned to the ruins of the throne one last time. The chamber was overgrown now, roots breaking through marble, flowers blooming in the cracks where once blood and oil had mingled. He stood before the empty dais, the faint shimmer of morning light cutting through the dust. He whispered, "Are you still there?" The wind answered with a soft, distant hum, the same pulse he had always felt, steady and alive. He smiled. Somewhere in the void, beyond the reach of stars, the echo of that smile traveled, carried on a current of memory older than gods. The galaxy turned. Humanity endured. And in every heart that dared to hope, the Emperor still breathed, not as ruler, not as God, but as the quiet certainty that life itself was divine. The light had not returned. It had never left.